Esteemed colleagues, we gather here to shape the future of our industries. Let us commit to bold, unified action for lasting prosperity. Together we will lead. The time has come to address our shared future.
We must proceed with unity and resolve.
At a black tie harbor dedication ceremony, attended by shipping magnates, venture capitalists, and 3 sitting senators, Mara Ellery stood at the podium and made a declaration that silenced every conversation in the room. She said she would only remarry if her mute son handed his father's compass, the brass one Callan had not let go of in 16 months, to the man himself. The crowd laughed. The way powerful people laugh at things they don't quite believe, because everyone knew what that vow really meant. Callan Ellery had not spoken a complete sentence since the night his father's vessel went down 12 miles off the coast. He barely made eye contact. He certainly didn't hand anything to anyone. It was, as one board member whispered to another, the most elegant locked door she had ever built. Then, in the middle of her own speech, Callan walked off the stage. He didn't go to the investors. He didn't go to the men in tailored suits who had been engineering reasons to crouch down and speak to him all evening. He walked to a man standing near the sound board, a library bus driver nobody had noticed, and he placed the compass in his hands. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a child sees through every adult in the room, stay with this story. And if stories like this are your thing, hitting subscribe takes 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss the next one. Dorian Bell was not the kind of man a room noticed. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered but unhurried in the way he moved, with calloused hands that came from years of loading and unloading book crates, rather than anything more glamorous. He drove the Mobile Ball Library van for the Harrow Bay Coastal School District, a converted blue and white vehicle that made its rounds through the lower neighborhoods every Tuesday and Friday, stopping in front of community centers, church parking lots, and the worn concrete plaza outside the old cannery building. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment behind a laundromat on Tide Street with his daughter, Mira, who was 8 years old and had very strong opinions about which shelf her books belonged on. The apartment was small. The walls needed repainting. The kitchen window faced a brick wall. None of that seemed to bother either of them much. Dorian's salary was modest. His social standing was non-existent in any circle that used the phrase social standing. He did not own property, did not attend fundraisers, and had never been photographed at anything. What he did have, the thing nobody catalogued, because nobody thought to look, was an unusual kind of attention. He remembered which kid had checked out the same ocean atlas 3 times in a row. He remembered which one flinched when adults asked too many questions. He remembered which ones went quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because the room had stopped being safe. That particular talent had no market value until it did. Mara Ellery ran a company that moved freight across 4 ocean corridors and employed over 3,000 people. Ellery Harbor Group had expanded under her late husband's leadership, and then, after his death, had expanded further under hers, a fact that surprised people who did not know her and surprised no one who did. She was 42, precise in her thinking, careful with her words in public, and privately exhausted in the way that only people carrying too much for too long ever get exhausted. Her husband, James Ellery, had died 16 months ago. When the research vessel he was consulting on went down in a storm off the northern coast, they never recovered the ship. They recovered some of the crew. James was not among them. After the funeral, Mara returned to work in 11 days. People called it strength. She called it the only available option. Her son Callan was 7 years old and had, before his father's death, been the kind of child who narrated everything. He had opinions about lighthouse architecture. He could identify 12 classes of cargo vessels by silhouette. He kept a hand-drawn map of every harbor within 200 miles of Harrow Bay taped above his desk, with small red dots marking the ones his father had taken him to see. After James died, Callan stopped talking. Not entirely. He could still respond to direct questions with a word or two, could still tell Tessa, his nanny, whether he was hungry or tired. But the narrating stopped. The lighthouse opinions stopped. The long, winding sentences about ocean currents and ship routes stopped. What remained was silence, and in the silence, one object, a brass compass that had belonged to his father, which Callan now carried in the left pocket of every jacket he owned. Therapists called it selective mutism, compounded by grief. Mara called it her son, disappearing in slow motion, and she did not know how to call him back. She had tried. She had hired specialists, changed schools, rearranged schedules. She had sat on the floor of his bedroom at 10 o'clock at night and read him every book about ships and navigation she could find. Some nights he leaned against her shoulder. Most nights he just held the compass and looked out the window toward the water. She did not know yet that on Friday afternoons something was beginning to shift. She did not know about the library van. Callan started appearing at the mobile library van on Friday afternoons in early October. He came with Tessa, who was 26 and genuinely kind, and completely at a loss for what to do with a child who had stopped speaking in full sentences. She would hold his hand on the walkover, let him set the pace, and then stand a few feet back while he approached the van, which was, on Fridays, parked in the community plaza, 2 blocks from Callan's school. The van smelled like old paper and the kind of dust that collects on things people love but don't handle carefully enough. Callan walked in the first time without speaking, without asking permission, and went directly to the shelf marked Oceans Navigation Exploration. He stood there for 11 minutes. He did not take anything. He did not respond when another adult volunteer asked if he needed help. He simply stood, reading spines, and then left. He came back the following Friday, and the one after that. Most adults who encountered Callan during those weeks made the same mistake. They crouched down to his eye level, which was well-intentioned, and then asked the wrong things. Do you want to take that one home? Do you miss your dad? Can you say something for me? Just one word? The questions were not cruel. They were just aimed at the wrong target, fired by people who needed Callan to respond so they could feel like they'd helped. Every time someone asked, Callan's shoulders would rise slightly toward his ears. He would take one small step back. His left hand would find the compass in his pocket. Dorian noticed this pattern on the 3rd Friday. He didn't comment on it. He didn't adjust his behavior loudly or make a point of being different. He simply stopped approaching Callan directly and started leaving things instead. A new ocean atlas, face up on the low table near the navigation shelf. A picture book about lighthouse keepers, angled so the cover was visible from where Callan usually stood. He treated it the way you'd treat a bird. You wanted to stay no sudden movements, no extended hand. Just the quiet suggestion that this space was safe. Then he noticed something else. Every Friday, at some point during the 45 minutes Callan spent in the van, the boy would drift toward the rear window, the one that faced east, across the plaza, toward the stretch of coastline where an old lighthouse tower stood behind a chain-link fence. The lighthouse had been decommissioned for years. The keeper's cottage beside it was boarded up, but on clear days, you could see the tower from the plaza, pale gray against the sky, still standing. The Dorian had heard, through the quiet network of people who work in community services and know more about local families than anyone acknowledges, that James Ellery used to take Callan to that lighthouse, that it had been one of their places. He didn't say anything about this to Callan. He didn't point out the window or ask if the lighthouse meant something. What he did, starting the following Friday, was park the van 4 feet further east than usual, just enough to open the sight line from the rear window directly to the lighthouse tower. It took Callan 2 Fridays to find the new angle on his own. When he did, he stood at the rear window for almost 6 minutes without moving, one hand pressed flat against the glass, the other holding the compass. Dorian shelved books at the front of the van and did not look back. When Tessa came to collect Callan that afternoon, she noticed he seemed calmer than usual. She mentioned it to Mara that evening. "The way you mention small things that feel like they might matter." Mara asked where exactly they parked the van. Tessa described the plaza, the eastern-facing, the old lighthouse visible in the distance. Mara stood in her kitchen for a long moment after Tessa finished. She didn't say anything either, but she started paying attention to Friday afternoons. The signals started small, the way most important things do. The first one came on a Friday in late October. Dorian was reorganizing the return cart when he noticed that the ocean atlas he'd left on the low table had been moved, not taken, just moved, repositioned so the spine faced the wall instead of the aisle. It was the kind of thing a child does when they've spent time with something and don't want anyone else to pick it up before they come back. He left the atlas in the same spot the following week. Callan came in, found it immediately, and spent 20 minutes with it open on the table. When he was done, he closed it carefully, aligned the corners with the edge of the table, and walked away. It was the most deliberate thing Dorian had watched a child do in years. The second signal came 3 weeks later. Dorian found a paper boat tucked inside the atlas, folded from a page torn from a small notebook, precise creases, the kind of fold that takes practice. It was wedged between the pages, showing the North Atlantic shipping lanes. He left it exactly where he found it. The third signal came in November, on a gray Friday, when the wind off the harbor made the van rock slightly on its axle. Callan arrived later than usual, already quiet in the particular way that meant something had happened before he got there. He went to the navigation shelf, pulled out a thin hardcover of coastal charts, and sat down at the low table. He opened it to a page showing the stretch of coastline north of Harrow Bay. He picked up one of the stubby pencils Dorian kept in a cup near the table, the ones meant for checkout slips, and carefully circled the lighthouse symbol on the chart. Then he pushed the book across the table toward Dorian, who was sitting 2 feet away cataloging returns. Dorian looked at the circled lighthouse. He looked at Callan. He nodded once. The way you acknowledge something real without making it into a ceremony, and went back to his cataloging. Callan stayed for another 20 minutes. When he left, he didn't take the book, but he left the pencil on top of it, balanced deliberately across the circled page. Dorian understood then that the boy was talking. Not with words, not yet, but with the precise and careful language of someone who had learned to communicate only through things he trusted not to talk back. While Callan was quietly building a vocabulary of paper boats and pencil circles, the world his mother occupied was moving in a different and uglier direction. Mara Ellery had become, in the 16 months since James's death, one of the most publicly scrutinized women in the regional business landscape. Ellery Harbor Group was profitable and expanding, which made it attractive. She was widowed and influential, which made her a target for a category of men who understood acquisition in both its financial and personal dimensions. Priesteston Vale was the most persistent of them. He was 51, silver-haired, and operated with the smooth confidence of a man who had never been told no in a way that stuck. His firm, Vale Capital, had been circling Ellery Harbor Group for months, positioning a proposed merger as a strategic opportunity while positioning himself as something warmer. He attended the same industry events Mara attended. He sent thoughtful notes after difficult quarters. He was careful to be seen as a supporter rather than a suitor, which was, Mara recognized, its own kind of strategy. He had also, on 2 occasions, attempted to engage Callan directly the first time. At a maritime industry dinner, Mara had brought Callan to at her son's rare request. There was a scale model of a container ship on display. Prieston had crouched down and called Callan chief. He'd told him the ship model was worth $40,000. Callan had looked at it for a moment and then walked away. The second time, Preston had sent a remote-controlled speedboat to the Ellery house with a card addressed to Callan. Mara had thanked him by email. Callan had put the boat in the closet without opening the box. Preston never asked what kind of books Callan liked. He never noticed which direction the boy looked when he thought no one was watching. Mara noticed that he never noticed. She filed it quietly, the way she filed everything that mattered, and said nothing. But exhaustion had been accumulating for a long time. The board was pressuring her toward the Vale merger. 3 other men were applying various forms of social pressure. She was too tired to keep deflecting. And so, at a private dinner with 2 board members in late November, she said something she had not entirely planned to say. She said she would only consider remarrying when Callan chose to give his father's compass to someone himself. She said it as a closing argument, a door she was locking from the inside. She did not anticipate that the statement would leave the room. The Ellery Harbor Scholarship Fund dedication ceremony took place on the 2nd Saturday of December, on the renovated northern pier of Harrow Bay. It was the kind of event that looked like philanthropy and functioned like a power display. 200 guests, a temporary pavilion draped in navy and white, catered by a restaurant that had a 6-month wait list. The fund itself was genuine. Mara had endowed it personally, not through the company, to provide educational support for children in the 4 lowest income zip codes surrounding the harbor. A new learning center was being unveiled. That same evening, a converted warehouse space 2 blocks from the pier that would house tutoring programs, a reading room, and, as part of a community partnership, a permanent stop for the Harrow Bay Mobile Library Service. That last detail was why Dorian Bell received an invitation. It came in a standard envelope with the Ellery Harbor Group letterhead, addressed to the Mobile Library Program, Harrow Bay Coastal School District. His supervisor forwarded it with a note that said attendance was optional, but appreciated. Dorian mentioned it to Mira, who told him he should wear the gray vest because the blue one had a loose button he wore. The gray vest. He arrived 20 minutes after the doors opened, found a spot near the sound equipment at the back left of the pavilion, and spent the first 30 minutes talking to 2 other community program coordinators he recognized from district meetings. He was not uncomfortable, exactly, but he was aware in the way that people are aware when they are in a room built for someone else. The glasses of wine were too large. The conversations happening around him were about valuations and regulatory frameworks, and a proposed port expansion he'd read about, but had no stake in. He was planning to leave by 8. Callan arrived with Tessa and Mara at 6:45. He was dressed in a dark navy suit that someone had clearly spent time selecting, with a white collar that was already slightly askew by the time they reached the pavilion entrance. His left hand was in his pocket. It was always in his pocket at events like this. The evening began the way these evenings always began for Callan. A procession of adults who wanted something from the interaction. A shipping executive with a red pocket square crouched down and asked if Callan liked boats. Callan looked at the man's shoes. A woman from the Port Authority told Callan he looked just like his father. Callan's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer to Tessa's side. A city council member attempted a handshake, found no response, and converted the gesture into an awkward wave that fooled no one. Each of these moments cost Callan something small and invisible. By the time Mara was called to the stage for the formal remarks, he had retreated so far inside himself that Tessa had quietly moved them both to the edge of the gathering, near a tall standing heater where the crowd thinned out. Mara stood at the podium and spoke well, because she always spoke well in public. She talked about her husband's belief that opportunity should be geographically distributed, not concentrated. She talked about the children of harbor workers and dock managers and school bus drivers who were just as capable as anyone in the room, and had been given fewer instruments to prove it. She talked about the learning center, the scholarship criteria, the community partnerships. She did not talk about Preston Vale, who was seated in the third row, in a charcoal suit, watching her with the attention of a man who has decided something. Preston had escalated his approach in the 3 weeks since Mara's vow had traveled beyond the private dinner where she'd first said it. He had begun referencing Callan in conversations with mutual acquaintances, carefully, always warmly, but often enough that it registered as intentional. He had positioned himself publicly as someone who understood what Mara was carrying. He had told at least 2 journalists, off the record, that he admired her dedication to her son. He had also arranged, through the event coordinator, to have a gift placed at the children's seating area near the stage, a silver-plated model yacht in a display case, with a small card that read, "For the captain of his own course, P.V." Among the guests that evening, roughly a third carried phones out on the table or in hand. Several were known to document these events for social feeds. A photographer from the regional business journal was stationed near the stage. The room was, in other words, exactly the kind of room where a single moment could travel very far, very fast. Callan had seen the silver yacht when they arrived. He had not touched it. Mara was midway through closing remarks when Preston Vale stood up. He did not ask permission. He did not signal the event coordinator. He simply rose from his third-row seat with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never needed to ask whether a room belonged to him, picked up the silver yacht from the children's table, and walked toward the stage. The move was smooth enough that several guests assumed it had been planned. A few began to shift in their seats with the anticipatory warmth of people expecting a touching moment. Someone near the back started a soft, premature applause that died when it found no company. Preston stepped up beside the podium, not behind Mara, but beside her, close enough to share the microphone without asking, and turned to face Callan, who was standing at the edge of the crowd with Tessa. "I think there's someone here tonight," Preston said, his voice carrying the resonance of a man who had spent decades in rooms with good acoustics, who deserves to be recognized. He held out the silver yacht toward Callan. Callan did not move. "Your father was one of the great men of this industry." Preston's voice dropped into a register that performed grief without containing it. "And I know he'd want his son to stand tall, to be strong, to be the kind of man." He paused, letting the room absorb it, that a real captain is. The silence that followed was not the moved kind. It was the kind that happens when something has gone wrong in a register that not everyone can hear yet. Callan's face had gone very still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of a child absorbing a blow and calculating whether he is allowed to react to it. His left hand found the compass in his pocket, his shoulders came up. His eyes dropped to the floor in front of him and stayed there. Tessa put a hand on his shoulder. It was not enough, because what Preston Vale had just done, with his borrowed grief and his silver yacht, and his declaration about real captains, was reach into the one space where Callan had been allowed to be quiet and demand a performance from it. He had taken the fact of a dead father and turned it into a prop for a man who had never once asked Callan what he saw when he looked at a lighthouse. Callan took one step back, then another. Then he turned and walked away from the stage. The pavilion went quiet in the uneven way of a crowd that doesn't know whether to be concerned or entertained. 200 people watched a 7-year-old in a navy suit move through them with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who knows exactly where he is going, even if no one else does. He walked past Preston, who had lowered the yacht and was recalibrating his expression. He walked past the front-row guests, the board members, the investors, the men who had spent the evening calculating angles. He walked past the event tables, past the heaters, past the standing clusters of people who parted for him, because something in the way he moved made stepping aside feel necessary. He walked to the back left of the pavilion. He stopped in front of Dorian Bell. Dorian had not moved from his spot near the sound equipment. He was still holding the same glass of water he'd been holding for 40 minutes. He was watching Callan approach with the same expression he used when a child pushed a book across a table to toward him, present, steady, making no demands on the moment. Callan reached into the left pocket of his navy jacket. He took out the brass compass. It was small and worn, the kind of object that had been handled thousands of times by someone who loved it. The glass face was slightly scratched. The brass casing had gone warm from being carried close to a body for 16 months. Callan held it out in both hands. The way you offer something you understand is important. Dorian looked at the compass. He looked at Callan. He did not reach for it immediately. He waited one beat, not from hesitation, but from respect, giving the gesture the weight it deserved. Then Callan spoke. His voice was a little rough from disuse, and it came out quieter than it probably felt inside him. But it was clear. Every word was clear. "You know the way to my lighthouse." 5 words that had taken 16 months to arrive. The pavilion, which had been murmuring, went completely silent. Mara, still standing at the podium, heard her son's voice cut through 200 people and a sound system and the low ambient noise of a harbor at night. And she stopped, not breathing, for a moment that had no measurable length. Preston Vale stood in the middle of the room, holding a silver yacht that no one was looking at anymore. Dorian Bell looked at the boy in front of him, this careful, deliberate, profoundly serious child who had spent 4 months building a private language out of paper boats and pencil circles, and 6 minutes of silence at a rear window, and felt the full weight of what was being handed to him. Not just the compass, the trust. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then a board member in the second row, a man named Gerald Whitfield, who had made a career out of reading rooms and responding to them, laughed and said, loudly enough to carry, "Well, looks like the boy just picked his mother's next husband." It landed the way those kinds of remarks always land when the room is uncertain and someone offers it a direction. A ripple of laughter moved through the pavilion. Then applause, uneven at first, then building. Someone near the back made a comment that got swallowed by the noise. 2 people raised phones. Callan's hand, still extended toward Dorian, had not moved, but his face had changed. The openness that had been there, the rare openness of a child who has just done something that cost him enormously, was closing, not all at once. Incrementally, the way a door closes when the wind changes direction. He was watching the room laugh, and he was understanding, in whatever way a 7-year-old processes the sensation of being misread, that what he had just done was being turned into something else. Tessa, who had followed him through the crowd, reached him and put her hand on his shoulder again. This time she didn't say anything. She just stood beside him, which was the right instinct. Within 6 minutes, the moment was on social media. Someone had photographed the approach, Callan walking through the parted crowd, back straight, hand in pocket. The Business Journal photographer had captured the compass exchange from 30 feet away, blurred but legible. A third image showed Dorian's face. In the moment after, Callan spoke a face that photographed as stunned and overwhelmed, which the internet immediately narrated as a man who just won the lottery. The first caption that gained traction read, "Kid son of billionaire CEO picks broke library bus driver as stepdad. No, seriously." By the time the formal program concluded, the story had outpaced the scholarship fund announcement by a ratio that would have depressed anyone who cared about the scholarship fund. Preston Vale moved through the room with the controlled efficiency of a man converting a loss into an opportunity. He found 2 journalists. He recognized one from a regional business publication, one from a lifestyle outlet that covered wealth and social dynamics in the coastal metro area, and spoke to both of them quietly, in the unhurried tone of a concerned observer. What he suggested, without stating directly, was that the situation had the texture of something orchestrated, that a man with access to a grieving child, over a period of months, in an unsupervised setting, might have understood exactly what he was positioning himself for. that the mobile library program, charming as it was, placed adults with limited background scrutiny into sustained contact with vulnerable children from prominent families. He did not say Dorian Bell was a predator. He was too careful for that. He said, instead, that he hoped the appropriate questions would be asked, that a child's emotional state was a serious matter, that he personally found the whole thing troubling. Both journalists thanked him for his candor. Mara had come down from the stage during the applause and was standing 20 feet from Dorian and Callan when the laughter started. She watched her son's face change. She watched the room take the most honest thing Callan had done in 16 months and fold it into an anecdote. She felt two things simultaneously, and they were not compatible. The first was a flooding, physical relief, because her son had spoken, clearly, in full sentences, in public, and she had heard his voice cut through the noise of 200 people, and it had sounded like him, like the boy who used to narrate lighthouse architecture and argue about cargo vessel classifications at dinner. The second was a cold, descending dread, because she had made a vow in a private room that had become public, and that vow had just been activated in front of every person she knew professionally. And the man it pointed toward was standing near the soundboard in a gray vest, looking like he wanted to disappear. She started moving toward them. She did not know yet what she was going to say. Dorian was still holding the compass when the applause peaked. He had not closed his hand around it. It sat in his open palm, the way Callan had placed. It offered, not transferred, and he was looking at it with the expression of a man trying to understand the full dimension of what had just been handed to him before he decided what to do with it. The room was still loud. People were taking pictures. Gerald Whitfield was telling someone nearby that he'd seen a lot of things at these events, but nothing quite like this. Two of Mara's board members were having a conversation that involved frequent glances in Dorian's direction. The word charming floated past him from somewhere to his left, used in a tone that meant something closer to convenient. Dorian understood what was available to him in this moment. He was not naive, and he was not so removed from ambition that he couldn't feel the shape of what was being offered. A man like him, no assets, no connections, a government salary, a daughter who needed new school shoes, standing in the middle of a story the public was already writing, a story in which he was the humble, deserving protagonist selected by a child's pure instinct for goodness. It was the kind of story people wanted to be true. It had the architecture of something real. He could accept the compass. He could stand here and let the moment settle into the narrative the room was building. He could be gracious and quiet and let Mara Ellery's vow do what vows do when they've been made public, and a child has technically fulfilled the conditions. He could, in other words, let Callan carry this for him. And that was the thing he could not do. He crouched down. Not the crouching down that adults do when they want to seem approachable, the performance of accessibility. He went down on one knee on the pavilion floor, which put him slightly below Callan's eye level, and he waited until the boy looked at him directly. Callan's expression was complicated in the way that children's expressions are when they are feeling too many things to sort and have learned not to show any of them. Dorian held the compass out, flat on his palm between them. "I'm really honored that you trust me," he said. He said it quietly enough that it was for Callan and not for the room. "That means more to me than I can tell you." He paused, making sure the next part landed cleanly. "But this compass belongs to you and your dad. Nobody gets to use it to make decisions for you. Not me, not anyone." He took Callan's hand gently and placed the compass back into it. He folded Callan's fingers around it carefully. "The way you close a book you want someone to keep." Callan looked down at his own hand, then back up at Dorian. Something in his face shifted, not the closing down that had happened during the applause, but something quieter and more internal. The expression of someone who has just had a thing confirmed that they were not entirely sure they were allowed to believe. Dorian stood up. He turned to face the room. 200 people, the noise tapering as they registered that something was happening that required attention. Phones still raised. Whitfield still watching. Preston Vale, 20 feet away, with the controlled neutrality of a man waiting to see which way a thing would fall. Dorian was not a public speaker. He did not have a practiced voice for rooms like this. What he had was the flat, careful tone of someone who had decided what was true and was going to say it once. Callan didn't choose a husband for his mother, he said. The room was fully quiet now. He chose an adult who stood next to his grief without asking him to explain it. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform it. That's all. That's the whole thing. And it doesn't belong to any of you. He looked at Mara for one moment, not as an appeal, not as a plea, just as an acknowledgement that she was in this room, and she had heard her son's voice, and she understood more than anyone else present what it had cost him. Then he looked at Callan. "You did something brave tonight," he said. "Whatever happens next, that part was yours." He picked up his jacket from the chair beside the soundboard, nodded once to the 2 community coordinators he'd been talking to earlier, and walked out of the pavilion. The silence he left behind lasted longer than the one after Callan spoke. Then it broke into several simultaneous conversations, which is what crowds do when they have witnessed something they haven't finished processing. Whitfield said, to no one in particular, that the man had some nerve. One of Mara's board members said, quietly, that he thought it was the most dignified thing he'd seen at one of these events in 15 years. Preston Vale excused himself from the conversation he was in and stepped outside, where he made 2 phone calls in succession. Mara stood in the middle of the pavilion with her son beside her, Callan's hand in hers, the compass back in his left pocket where it belonged. She was watching the exit where Dorian had gone. Around her, the story was already being rewritten by people who had not understood the original. She had understood it. That was almost worse, because it meant she knew exactly what had just walked out the door, and she had no idea yet whether she had the right to follow it. The story hit every regional outlet by Sunday morning. The framing varied by publication, but converged on the same essential shape. A billionaire widow's silent son had bypassed a room full of powerful men to hand a brass compass to a library bus driver, and the library bus driver had then refused it and delivered a speech that was either deeply principled or deeply calculated, depending on which version of the story the reader preferred. Preston Vale's off-the-record suggestions had found their audience by Monday. 2. Parent complaints had been filed with the Harrow Bay Coastal School District regarding the mobile library program, both citing concerns about adult supervision protocols and the appropriateness of sustained one-on-one contact between program staff and children from vulnerable family situations. The complaints did not name Dorian directly. They did not need to. His supervisor, a careful woman named Diane Marsh, who genuinely valued the program and genuinely valued Dorian, called him into her office on Monday afternoon and told him she was not suspending anything, but that the district would need to review the program's contact guidelines before the next scheduled run. She said it in the tone of someone delivering bad news they consider unfair, but cannot currently prevent. Dorian drove home that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, without doing anything in particular. Mira was at a friend's house. The apartment was quiet in the way that apartments are quiet when a person is in them alone and has too much to think about. He was not angry about the complaints. He understood the mechanism take something clean and describe it in the language of suspicion long enough. And the suspicion begins to seem like the responsible interpretation. He had seen it happen to other people. He had not expected to be the subject of it. What he was, if he examined it carefully, was tired. And beneath the tired, something more precise. He was afraid that Callan would hear about the complaints and believe, in the private and unargued way that children absorb the atmospheres around them, that what he had done at the pier had caused damage, that his compass and his 5 words and his brave, costly walk through 200 people had produced something bad. That fear was worse than the complaints. That was the thing that kept him at the kitchen table past the point when he would normally have started dinner. Mara's crisis was a different shape but the same weight. In the 4 days following the ceremony, she held 2 board calls, fielded 6 media inquiries through her communications director, and received a formal letter from Vale Capital requesting an expedited response to the proposed merger terms. The letter's language was professional, and its timing was not. Preston had moved from social pressure to structural pressure, and the message was legible. The disruption at the ceremony had created instability, and instability was an argument for consolidation. Her general counsel advised her to consider the merger terms on their financial merits and separate that consideration from anything personal. This was reasonable advice that assumed the 2 things were separable, which they were not. But the thing Mara kept returning to, in the margins of board calls, and in the 40 minutes between when Callan went to sleep and when she could, was not Preston and not the merger and not the media coverage. It was the vow. She had made it in a private room as a door she was locking from the inside. She had made it because she was exhausted, and because the men pursuing her were relentless. And because she needed something that would function as a wall, she had reached for Callan's silence as a mechanism. Unconsciously, she understood now, which did not make it better because she knew his silence was the one condition no one could engineer their way around. Except she had been wrong about that. And more importantly, she had been wrong about something else. She had taken her son's grief and made it a test, not intentionally, not cruelly, but the effect was the same. She had placed Callan at the center of a calculation about her own future and told herself it was a safeguard. She had used the most damaged and private part of him as a lock on a door. She was too tired to guard herself, sitting in her home office at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, with Callan asleep down the hall, and the harbor visible as a dark shape through the window. Mara understood this about herself fully for the first time. The understanding was not comfortable. It was the discomfort of recognizing that you have done something that harmed the person you most wanted to protect, with the very intention of protecting them. She opened her laptop. She had a press conference scheduled for Thursday, originally planned as a follow-up to the scholarship fund announcement, now, inevitably, going to be about everything else. She had been planning to say as little as possible about the ceremony, to redirect toward the learning center, to let the story exhaust itself. She closed the document her communications director had drafted. She opened a new one and began to write. The press conference was held at the Harrow Bay Learning Center on Thursday afternoon. Mara had chosen the location deliberately. Not the Ellery Harbor Group headquarters, not a hotel ballroom, not the pier. The Learning Center, a converted warehouse space with unfinished concrete floors and borrowed folding chairs, and the smell of fresh paint over old wood, was the place the scholarship fund had actually built. It was a room that meant something because of what it was for, not what it cost. She stood at a plain podium without a backdrop. No company logo, no event branding. Her communications director had suggested both, and she had declined both. There were 14 journalists in the room and a small cluster of community program staff, including 2 of the district coordinators who had been at the pier ceremony. Diane Marsh was there. The Learning Center's volunteer coordinator was there. One of the parents from the mobile library program's regular Friday route was there with her daughter, who was 6, and had brought a book to read during the boring parts. Mara placed her notes on the podium and did not look at them. She began with the scholarship fund, because that was what the Learning Center was, and it deserved to be spoken about without the ceremony surrounding it. She talked about the selection criteria, the first cohort of recipients, the tutoring program that would begin in January. She talked about it for 4 minutes, which was the correct amount of time, and she meant every word of it. Then she stopped and was quiet for a moment. The room understood was a transition. "I made a public vow 16 months into my son's grief," she said. "I made it because I was tired, and because I needed a wall, and because I reached for the one thing I knew no one could get past." She paused. "I used my son's silence as a lock. That was wrong. And I'm saying so publicly because it was said publicly. And because the people in this room deserve to hear me take responsibility for it, rather than manage it." One of the journalists started to ask a question. Mara held up one hand, not aggressively, just with the clarity of someone who has not finished. No child should carry the weight of a parent's romantic decisions, not as a test, not as a safeguard, not as a condition. What Callan did at the ceremony last Saturday was not the fulfillment of a vow. It was a 7-year-old boy communicating something true about his own experience. Those are different things, and I allowed the first framing to obscure the second, and I am not going to do that anymore. She looked out at the room. The vow is withdrawn. It should not have been made. My son's healing is his own, and it will happen on his timeline, and it is not a mechanism for anything. She moved, without pausing, to Preston Vale. She did not use the word blackmail. Her general counsel had advised against it, and she had agreed for legal reasons, not personal ones. But she described, in the flat and precise language of someone reading from documented evidence, the timeline of Vale Capital's media contacts following the ceremony. She described the nature of the suggestions made. She described the letter, requesting expedited merger response and its relationship to the public disruption of a community event. She announced that Ellery Harbor Group was withdrawing from merger discussions with Vale Capital. Effective immediately. She announced that the company was redirecting the community investment previously allocated to the proposed joint initiative, a significant sum, directly to the Harrow Bay Mobile Library Program and the Learning Center's first-year operating budget. She said this in the tone of someone making a business decision, because it was a business decision, and she did not editorialize it beyond what the facts required. Then, she said one more thing. "There's a man who works for this program," she said. "He is not here today because I did not invite him, because I don't think he wants to be at a press conference, and because I've learned recently that the most important things he does are the ones nobody photographs." A few journalists wrote something down. One looked up. "He did something last Saturday that I want to name correctly, because it has been named incorrectly by almost everyone else. He protected my son from becoming the justification for an adult's opportunity. He did it in public, at personal cost, with no benefit to himself, and then he left." She looked down at the podium for a moment, then back up. "I don't think that requires my elaboration. I think it speaks clearly enough on its own." She took her notes off the podium. "The Learning Center opens for programming on January 6th. The mobile library route resumes next Friday. Those are the things worth covering." She looked at the journalist in the front row. "I'll take questions about the scholarship fund." The questions about the scholarship fund lasted 11 minutes. The questions about everything else lasted considerably longer, but Mara answered only the ones that were about Callan's welfare or the program's future, and declined the rest with a consistency that eventually caused the room to accept it. Diane Marsh, on her way out, stopped beside Mara and said simply, "The route resumes Friday." Mara nodded. "Good," she said. She found him on a Tuesday evening, 4 days after the press conference. She had gotten the location from Diane Marsh, who had given it without commentary, which Mara appreciated. She drove herself, which she rarely did anymore, in the kind of deliberate ordinary that felt necessary for the occasion. No driver, no communications director, no prepared remarks. The old bus depot on Calder Street was a low concrete building with a chain-link fence and a parking lot that needed resurfacing. The mobile library van was pulled into the side bay, its rear doors open. Dorian was inside, crouched over a bottom shelf unit that had come loose from its bracket, working it back into alignment with the focused attention of someone who fixes things properly rather than quickly. He heard her footsteps on the concrete and looked up. He did not look surprised. Exactly. He looked like a man who had been expecting something and had not known what form it would take. Mara stopped at the open rear doors of the van. She looked at the shelves, the careful organization of them, the labels in neat block print, the low table with the cup of pencils, and then at Dorian. "I owe you an apology," she said. He set down the bracket tool he was holding. "You don't. I do." She said it without argument in her voice, just as a fact. "My vow put you in the middle of something you had no part in building. What happened at the pier, the coverage, the complaints, the review that came from my mistake, not yours. I'm sorry for the damage it caused." Dorian was quiet for a moment. He looked at the shelf bracket, then back at her. "The program's running again," he said. "Diane told me about the funding. You didn't have to do that." "I wanted the program to continue," Mara said. That wasn't an apology. That was a correction. He looked at her for a moment with the same expression he used on children, who had said something more precise than they intended. Then something in his face relaxed, just slightly, in the way of a person who has been braced for a long time and has just found a reason to stop. "Do you want to come in?" he said. "There's a step." She climbed the step into the van. They sat on opposite ends of the low bench that ran along the driver's side wall. The way two people sit when they are in a small space and are being careful with the distance between them. The van smelled like old paper and the sea air that came through the open doors from the direction of the harbor. Mara talked about Callan, not the way she talked about him publicly, not the careful, protective language of a parent managing a narrative, but the way she talked about him at 11 o'clock at night when she was alone, and the harbor was a dark shape through the window. She talked about above his desk, and the cargo vessel classifications, and the way he used to argue about lighthouse architecture at dinner. She talked about the 11 days between the funeral and her return to work, and what those 11 days had actually contained, and what it had cost to convert them into a performance of strength. She talked about Vow, where it had come from, what she had been trying to protect, what she had failed to see she was doing to Callan in the process. Dorian listened, the way he did everything, without filling the spaces before they were finished, without converting her words into an occasion for his own. When she was done, he told her about Mira, about the first year after his wife left, when Mira was 4, and he had understood for the first time what it meant to be the only person standing between a child and the full weight of the world, about the mobile library job, which he had taken because the hours allowed school pickups, and which had turned out to matter to him in ways he hadn't budgeted for. About the kids on the route, the ones who checked out the same book 6 times, the ones who came in wet from rain and stayed until it stopped, the ones who were quiet for reasons he recognized. About Callan, who had been the most particular kind of quiet, the kind that knows exactly what it's doing. He wasn't broken, Dorian said. He was waiting for a room that wasn't going to demand something from him. Mara looked at the pencil cup on the low table. "He found one," she said. "He did." They did not make any decisions. That evening they talked until the light outside the van changed from late afternoon to early dark, and then Mara climbed down the step and Dorian walked her to her car, and they stood in the badly surfaced parking lot for a moment, in the way of two people who have said enough real things to each other that the ordinary logistics of leaving had become slightly complicated. "Callan has Fridays," Mara said. "I know," Dorian said. She drove home. What followed was not a story. It was an accumulation of ordinary things that turned into something over time, the way most real things do. Callan began talking more in November, then more again in December, not because anyone had implemented a new strategy, but because he had somewhere to put things. He talked about lighthouse architecture again. He talked about cargo vessel classifications. He started a new map, This one of every lighthouse on the eastern seaboard, with small blue dots marking the ones he wanted to visit, Mara and Callan discovered. On a Friday afternoon in December, when Mara came along on the library route for the first time, that they had identical opinions about the correct order in which to read a particular series of nautical adventure books. This discovery produced a 40-minute argument conducted with great seriousness and mutual respect that Dorian and Tessa observed from a careful distance. In January, Mara filed the paperwork to convert the old lighthouse keeper's cottage into a community reading room. It took 4 months of permits and 2 months of renovation. On the morning of the opening, Callan carried the brass compass from the car to the cottage himself. Without being asked, and placed it in the small glass case they had built into the reading room wall. Beside it, on a card he had written himself in the careful block print of a child who takes handwriting seriously, it said, "For anyone who has ever been lost but still found the light." Mara and Dorian did not arrive at each other quickly or dramatically. There was no declaration on a pier, no rain, no moment constructed for an audience. There was a Tuesday evening in the bus depot. There were Friday afternoons at the learning center. There were two parents who had both spent a long time, being tired and careful and stronger than they felt, discovering over the course of ordinary months that they had stopped performing those things for each other. He did not love her because she was powerful and lonely. She did not love him because he was humble and kind. Those were the surfaces of them. What they found underneath was something less photogenic and more durable. Two people who had learned by separate and difficult routes that the most important things you do for a child are the ones you do when no one is watching. That the same is probably true for the people you love. Callan did not choose a stepfather. He chose the first adult who understood that his silence was not a problem to be solved, that his grief was not a performance to be managed, that his compass was his own, and his lighthouse was his own, and his heart was not a door that needed anyone else's key. Everything else followed from that, as it should. There's something this story keeps coming back to, the idea that genuine kindness doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly, again and again, in the moments no one photographs. Dorian didn't fix Callan. He just made sure there was always one place in the world where the boy didn't have to explain himself. Most of us, at some point, have needed that a person who sits with us without asking us to perform our healing on their schedule. And most of us, if we're honest, know exactly how rare that is. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, the kind that take their time and mean what they say, subscribe. New stories drop every week, and they're all free. We'll see you in the next one.